Welcome back. Today we have a fun episode. This is going to be a fun show today because we're going to talk to someone who's not only an expert in the sports broadcasting industry, someone who is doing it right now, but someone who's also evolved and now coaches sports broadcasters and aspiring sportscasters. And I'm talking, of course, about Phil Giubileo. Phil, welcome to the show today.
How's it going? Thank you so much, Rich, for having me. Rick, so much for having me. Rich.
Yeah, call me whatever you
right?
want. Either one is fine. Either one is fine. It's great to have you here. It's a pleasure, and I've been following a lot of your material, your play-by-play posts, which is really awesome on social media, and I want to talk about that. I also want to get into your sports coaching, your sports broadcasting, teaching and coaching and mentorship, because it's so important for aspiring sportscasters. But I think a good place to start would be the fact that we're both graduates of Fordham, graduates of WFUV radio, and we just had the NBA Finals conclude with Mike Breen at the microphone. There was a lot of questioning about how he would approach it, being that he's the voice of the Knicks and has done so for decades, and also obviously the voice of the NBA. What are your thoughts on how Mike Breen did with the NBA Finals and the Knicks' victory?
Oh, I thought Brini was fantastic. He did an amazing job. And I know there were comments and thoughts, and you would see them on social media, always being a homer. I think part of it just honestly, it's not that he was a homer per se, but that the exciting moments throughout that series really belonged to the Knicks. Every game they had to come back from double-digit deficits. So the drama played in the Knicks' favor, and it doesn't matter who was calling that series. Those moments were so electric that they were huge, exciting ones. And was there, I don't want to say there was a lean toward the Knicks. I think the coverage was equally excitable in big moments. If you're talking about the raw emotion of calling a game, when San Antonio had their big moments, he called them as they were big moments. So I think in that sense, the inflection points that he used, how he called the game, the information, he was completely unbiased, as he always is when it comes to matters that take place on the court. You know, he's not favoring one way or the other. And I think sometimes fans don't realize that that's also a big part of whether someone is quote unquote being a homer or not, is how are they looking at those moments when there's a referee review and they're looking under the hood at some video or things of that nature. So I thought he did a great job. And yes, he's called Knick games for well over 30 years. That's part of who he is. And I thought, and I'm sure you're thinking about this too, the advice that Joe Buck gave him before the start of the NBA Finals, with Joe Buck looking back at his own career and how he called the 2006 World Series, and he really muted himself because he did not want to look like a St. Louis Cardinals homer because of the Buck last name. And I think he might have still been doing some regional work with the Cardinals 20 years ago. Eventually he walked away from that. But then you go too far in the opposite direction and you're underselling what is taking place on the court. Imagine if that was underplayed. Imagine if it was low key with some of those exciting moments, the Anunoby, the hand of God, the tip last moment. If you undersell those big moments, it ends up sounding and looking much worse.
It always cracks me up when I see the top broadcasters in national telecasts or radio broadcasts. They always take so much heat, whether it's Buck, whether it's Costas, Al Michaels, Breen. I don't see so much criticism of Breen, but it seems like they get criticism. He was a homer for the other team. No, he was a homer for the other team. And I always say, if you're making everyone unhappy, you're probably doing it right down the middle. What's your philosophy and your feel on a national broadcaster or even a local hometown market broadcaster, where they should be in terms of objectivity versus homerism?
I have two schools of thought. Let's talk first about how it works out on the national level. And the way you're thinking about it is right. If everybody hates you, from both sides, based on the teams that are playing, you're probably doing a pretty good job maintaining your neutrality as far as how you're calling the game, what you're saying, because that's a big part of it when you are calling a national game. There's the emotion part of it. There's the inflection. There's the excitement level. If you are really downplaying one team when they score a goal in a hockey game versus another, there's that part of it. But other fans are, they're just hyping up these guys or they're hyping up those guys. And they're really just talking about that. Again, part of that depends on what's going on in the game, right? So if you have, I'll give you hockey, for example, with the Hurricanes coming off of the Stanley Cup final against Vegas, and you'll have fans say, "Oh, they're certainly just pulling for Vegas in this final. Vegas is the big market." And you have other fans saying vice versa. No, they're pulling for Rod Brindamore and the Hurricanes. And well, when you are making those comments on social media, what's going on in the game at that moment? Because often that's what's dictating how the announcers are covering the broadcast at that moment. It's usually if they're talking more about one team, it's because they're doing a little bit more at that time. Now, when you look to local broadcasts, so I've always said you never forget who signed your paycheck. And I really do believe that. Now, there's the covering the game. If you are covering a local broadcast straight down the middle, as far as being equally excited across both, giving the same amount of information across both, I don't know if you're fully servicing the home crowd. Now, with that said, you need to be factual. You need to provide correct information. So it's not about if the Mets are playing the Phillies as they did last night, and Gary Cohen's calling the game on SNY. He's not going to make stuff up to make the Phillies look bad. But is it gonna be a pro Mets broadcast? You know it is. If there's a more exciting moment for the Mets, Juan Soto hits a couple of home runs, is he gonna get more juiced up for that? Yes. Is he gonna be excited if Schwarber hits a home run? Yeah, he had a chance to walk it off last night. Thankfully, as a Mets fan, he did not. But if he walks it off, there'll be inflection. But he's not going to be like, "Oh yeah, the Phillies won the game," because then you're going to have, hundreds of thousands of Mets fans upset with that because they're upset. So part of that local broadcast feel is you're trying to convey the game as you are to fans of that team. That's really your core focus. That's my opinion. And I've been mostly a local broadcaster covering games for teams throughout my entire career. So there's the factual bit of it where you need to be right and you need to not necessarily distort information to favor one side or the other. And then the emotional part of it where you're going to play a little bit more into the hands of your home broadcast.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think part of it is when you're broadcasting a team every day, you get to know the team, you get to know the storylines, the players, the coaches, and you just naturally want them to do well just because some of them become acquaintances or friends, or you're just more familiar with them. So you want them to do well. Is that what you found throughout the different sports, hockey and other sports you've done?
Oh goodness, yes. And it's tough sometimes because you get to know some of these players really well, and eventually you do get to become friendly with them or friends. And I experienced that a lot more earlier in my career when I was calling the Danbury Trashers games and the Bridgeport Sound Tigers games, mainly because when I was in Danbury, I was pretty close to their age at that time. And I traveled to all the road games and I was with them a lot more, as opposed to now for almost a decade at Quinnipiac. These are college students. We're not necessarily obviously we're not close in age. I've been doing this for a long time. And you don't get the day-to-day camaraderie as you do or as I did on the professional level. Now, I know a lot of these players pretty well for college. I interview them a lot. We see them a lot at the ring. So it's very cordial. And as a broadcaster, there's that, but you also don't want to necessarily, because you're friendly with a player, make up excuses if they're not performing well. You don't want to cover for them. It's, you still want to be fair. Again, calling college hockey at the D1 level, I don't necessarily go out of my way to rip anyone, honestly, on the broadcast, whether it's home or visiting team. That's not how I call games. It's not. There's critical analysis, and then there's what you've heard. In fact, you mentioned the play-by-play pulse, and I recently had a game from the Calder Cup Finals, and the analyst went off on a referee in an important moment, and really went, in my opinion, way over the line in what I would call criticism. As play-by-play announcers, we're there to be a fly on the wall and describe what's going on and provide analysis of what is going on, but it is not meant to interject opinion to the level where it distorts. I want fans watching to be able to kind of hear my thoughts and formulate their own opinions about it.
It's amazing. There's so many different directions I can take it after that answer, because you talked about your philosophy, you talked about your background. When I discuss with students my career, whether it was in professional baseball, working for the Devil Rays, the Rangers, the Yankees, or then working in basketball and hockey for Army Sports at West Point, they're often surprised when I tell them the first two organizations for 6 years never told me what to say or what not to say on the air. The year I spent with the Yankees AA team, they did have some thoughts about specific things I said, specifically the weather. And we sometimes butted heads because I described it. And sometimes they didn't want me to. If it was April, it was cold. They didn't want to dissuade fans from coming to the game. But the 2 years with West Point broadcasting basketball and hockey, never once did they ever say what to say or what not to say. What's your experience, Ben, with so many of the different places you've broadcast? Did you ever have anyone say, yes, say this, or don't say that?
Honestly, not at all. Not a bit. I've been real fortunate to work for organizations that have given me that level of freedom to broadcast games as I see fit. Going all the way back to my first gigs in minor league baseball, I was doing independent ball with the River City Rascals and then the USHL in St. Louis. And in both cases, the person that hired me was a broadcaster, Ken Wilson, who called games for years and major league level games. He was the voice of the Blues for 20 years, and he worked for several MLB teams. He called the Pete Rose record-breaking hit on TV. He was on the air for that. So that was one of his big baseball moments, and he's done everything. So he had a broadcaster's perspective, and he was the one that hired me. So he gave me a lot of freedom to call the game as I see fit. And then even going on to Danbury, and a funny story about working with the Danbury Trashers, Jimmy Galante. And of course, this is a documentary on Netflix, and people have, a lot of people have watched Crime and Penalties on Netflix to talk about my time and just the Danbury Trashers history in general. You would think, going to an organization where, and if you watch it, that there would be some sort of level of control. And not once was I ever told what to say on the air. In fact, there was a game one night where there, even describing whatever, and this was back at a time where, the home team never lost a fight and the Trashers fought all the time. We had a guy that got into a fight and quite frankly did not do well. He lost the fight and it was a bit one-sided. He had just come back from an injury and he just got pummeled. And I described it accurately. And this was also on streaming video back at the time with the B2 networks. Well, the player the next day decides to confront me because he was mad that his mama, Jerry Hickey's mom, his mom was watching or listening to the broadcast and called him after the game. Oh my goodness, are you okay? You lost the fight. Is everything all right? And this guy was ready to throw down with me before we were about to get on a bus for a road trip. And thankfully, some players were like, this guy's a meathead, just, ignore it. And I did. And word got back to the owner. And Jimmy, I'm sitting in the office after that. He finds out what happened. And he's like, yeah, I don't want you to make up stuff if the guy loses a fight or, and he was a little bit more colorful with his language. You better say it the right way. because he wanted to hear the truth, especially on the road, because he would watch every game and wanted things to be honest and truthful, because that's what he expected out of he wanted his team to perform well. He didn't want anyone making excuses. So, I had an owner that backed me up. Same thing in Bridgeport. They never bothered me nor cared. And the same thing with Quinnipiac. And over time, you learn pretty quickly when you do this long enough what is going to work with the people that kind of control your employment. And so it becomes pretty easy to adjust. And luckily, I've never had to talk too much about the weather. So on broadcast, so I didn't have to worry about keeping fans away from the ballpark, because I only did minor league baseball for 3 seasons.
I think anyone who's broadcast for any length of time has those instances. I mean, I can recall times where players, groundskeepers, parking lot attendants physically wanted to confront me because I said the parking lot was in terrible shape, or the lines from the batter's box were crooked. I go to a commercial break, the groundskeeper standing right behind me and wants to fight. And I've had that with players too. But you walk in the clubhouse and they hear about something you said, and it's like you said with the mama. It's always the telephone game. By the time it gets back to the player, it's 10 times what you actually said.
Sure.
But I've always told students, one good way to approach this is always be willing to say to a player's face exactly what you're going to say on the air. And if you're questioning, is this something that's worthy of the air? Ask him, because maybe whether it's an injury, whether it's a personal situation, whatever, if you ask, you got clarification of what you can and can't say. What ground rules did you kind of set for yourself as an up and coming broadcaster?
Just again, when you're establishing relationships with these ball players, if you're meeting them for the first time and you're having conversations, you want to be honest and let them know. And some of these guys, once they've been around the park a while, they kind of know, what they can tell you on the record or off the record, but you explain it to them. It's like, hey, we're going to chat, we're going to get to know each other. If there's something you don't want me to report on and we're talking, just let me know, and we'll, it's off the record. That's fine. Again, I'm covering games for your team. The goal is to provide a positive light for the organization as much as possible. If I'm going to describe the game accurately. If you strike out or make a mistake or whatever the case may be, I'm not, I'm going to report that. I'm not looking to make you feel bad, or if numbers are numbers, right? If you're 0 for 22 at the plate, I have to report that. And that's all that really is. I'm not going to make, say stuff like, well, you know what, he's on the outs with his girlfriend, if I happen to know that, like that's why he's slumping at the plate. And players usually appreciate that. And very rarely would you have players come up and ask you not to. I had one player for a team a few years ago that was always willing to talk about hockey on the ice, but really did not want to delve into anything personal. And by the way, the person in question, their personal life, there was absolutely nothing kind of worth, like there was no juice or newsworthy items or anything like that. They were pretty mundane off of the playing surface, but they had a line, and it's just the line that they had set. And I'm like, all right, fine, we'll talk about hockey. We're not necessarily going to talk about, what kind of music you like, or, what's your favorite pizza place. I love to ask players about, especially in Connecticut with New Haven Pizza, what's your favorite pizza place? And, that worked out just fine. So, but rarely do you get an instance like that. I think as long as you're straightforward and honest with people, it works out most times. I mean, and then if sometimes, a player gets some, and you can explain that, and sometimes they hear about something and it's usually, as you said, second or third hand. And if they do come up and ask you a question, you explain it to them, and usually that kind of clears it out.
I mean, we definitely share a philosophy, which we both learned from Marty Glickman at WFUV at Fordham. I mean, he's the reason. Marty and Mike Breen were the reason I went to Fordham. What led you to go to Fordham University?
What led me to go to Fordham was one-on-one. When I was in high school, I was a regular caller to the show. I started calling every week my sophomore year. There was a friend of mine who knew about the program, and he was a regular caller at the time, T from the Bronx. And I don't know if he was still calling the show after I graduated. He may have
Yeah.
been. For all I know, he lived in, yeah, he was in like the Marble Hill section of the Bronx, the birthplace of hip hop. I think he was in the same, like in the same buildings. And so he turned me onto the show and I became a regular caller. And that, at that point, I didn't realize, I mean, I knew who Marty Glickman was, but I wasn't even aware that he was associated with Fordham at that point. And I wasn't thinking about play by play until I got to Fordham and started working at the station. And I had an opportunity to start sitting in on the workshops with Marty. Freshman year, at least when I was there, you didn't really do that until later on because you were just going through the workshop and you were just getting approved to go on the air and do updates. And if you were lucky, a halftime show or something like that. But we got invited to one at the end of the semester. It was right when Marty retired from calling the Jets games on WFAN, and he brought in a spotting board from the last game, and he was great. And just hearing him tell those stories, I'm like, oh, this is, I've always loved listening to the radio and play by play, and I think I'm going to try shifting my focus to start doing this. So really beginning with my sophomore year is I got very aggressive with calling demos, and I earned some color on football, and then eventually women's basketball play by play, and then I was just hooked from that point on.
It was great. There's no better place. And then it expanded, the time that I was there and Bob Aarons came in and just
Hmm.
really took it to another level where the players, we were covering Knick games, Ranger games,
Hmm.
Mets, Yankees on the field, in the dugout. And that was one of the special things about it, as well as the network. How important to you has that network been over your career? I mean, it's been, 25, 30 years since both of us graduated from Fordham, you a few years before me, but how important has that Fordham network been to you in your career?
Oh, it's been great. I think again, it's a family, and that's really, so it's a network, but I think it's also a family. And whether you went to school with certain guys or whatever, or if not, you came after me and many others. I've gotten to know them and have been able to reach out for things over the years from time to time, whatever it is that I might need or have a question about. And I think everyone's really great about hopping on board because it's a family. I've really developed my network since then. I think one of my superpowers as a broadcaster is my networking ability. I have not really ever had to interview for many of my assignments. Most of them I've been, knock on wood, able to get because of a relationship that I have with someone that helps me get my foot in the door, and I'm able to sell myself that way. So cutting the line, and I always talk to young sportscasters about that, how important it is to build that network, because nothing's more difficult than finding a job listing and knowing that you're just going to be one of 250 demos that gets sent in. And if you're the very best, God bless, because then you might have a shot at the job. Am I the very best play-by-play broadcaster? No, I'm pretty good, but I know that just my tape alone isn't going to hand me a gig. I know that I have to sell myself in other ways to convince hiring decision makers that I am the right person for a certain gig. And that has worked out well for me. The Fordham network is a big part of that. If it's ever come to, I know. So when I was in Iowa, which was the first job I had out of New York City, Spiro Ditas interned for me. He came out to Iowa for a short time, and I have cassette tape somewhere of Spiro and I calling baseball. Well, turn around years later, and it didn't work. I didn't get the gig, but years later, the year that Brendan Burke ended up getting the Islanders gig, and I had some contacts there as well, obviously from doing the Sound Tigers for 9 years, and I had done stuff on MSG, but I was able to get him to kind of reach out because he was, he had some good relationships with MSG from his time there, and he was very helpful. So, one hand kind of washes the other over very, very many, many years. And so I know I can reach out to people that I've helped in the past, that if they, if I go to them, they're willing to help me out. Dan Duva is another great example of someone that got his first hockey demos to eventually get him a job in the ECHL was because I helped him get a press pass to Bridgeport to call some games, which he called on, he called some demos and eventually used that to get the Trenton Devils gig. And now he's in the National Hockey League. So I know if I reach out to Dan and, if he has someone that can help me out, he'd be willing to do it because that's how we roll, right? That's how we all rolled it for him.
That's amazing. I never knew that story about Spiro. That was so cool because he was a couple years younger than me. But I did know that you were in Iowa. I remember sitting in the radio station, third floor of Keating Hall one day in 1995, I guess. And Sean Sullivan, Kyle Casey, where they were maybe teaching me how to cut tape, when you had to cut it with the razor. And I remember they brought up your name, Phil Giubileo, and I just always remembered that name because they were talking about you. You had graduated. I think it takes a lot of guts for a young professional in any career, but specifically we're talking about broadcasting, to graduate and then move to Iowa. What did that feel like? And what thoughts were going through your mind?
So I wasn't there long. So when I finished at Fordham, I did some other stuff before going to Iowa. I was actually a producer at WABC. I worked Devils games. I did the Yankees for a season, which was the longest summer of my life in 97. So the 1 year out of the 5 that they didn't win a World Series, that was the year I worked Yankees games. But there's nothing more, whatever. You get to 1 o'clock in the morning and they're playing on the West Coast. It's hard to just kind of stay focused. But all things aside, I decided to leave WABC because I wanted to work full-time on the air. So I, very early internet job searching, connected with KZAT in central Iowa and went out there. And I was only out there for about 8 months, but I really learned a ton there. I learned so much during that summer, just being a one-man band and getting to call, probably 50 or 60 games in a very short time frame across basketball and across baseball and softball. And I was the afternoon DJ. And I was going on remotes and I was helping sales guys go out and sell sports packages, and you kind of do everything. And, as someone that grew up in the Bronx, I'm from Throgs Neck, and leaving home for the first time and living on your own, it does take a lot. And I've never gone back to the Bronx since I left. I was in Iowa for 8 months, and then I went to Seattle and then to suburban St. Louis and then back to Connecticut. So there was a lot of moving around for a few years. And I suggest, now it's different because there are so many more opportunities, and people, if you're talented enough and you've built the right networks, you can stay reasonably close to home, which is excellent. But I always suggest, if you have that opportunity to go out into the middle of nowhere, get a gig at a radio station or even a TV station and do everything for a year, do it, because it's going to make you so much better as a broadcaster, because you'll have that independence and the ability to kind of build new relationships and think on the fly and do things that are well out of your comfort zone.
That's great advice. It's very similar to what Eric Spitz told me at WFAN when I interned there. He sat the interns down, midway through the internship and said, "What's your goal? What are your plans? What do you want to do?" And I think that's great advice. If you want to be on the air, go improve at being on the air. If you want to be behind the scenes, then maybe you could stay here at FAN and do it. And I want to get into some of your other pearls of wisdom. You've already offered plenty for sports broadcasters, but I touted this episode as Phil Giubileo's State of Sports Broadcasting, which you cover on your play-by-play pulse. If you had to sum up the state of sportscasting today, where's the industry? Where is it going? What do you think about the state of sports broadcasting in 2026?
Chaotic and unpredictable right now, when you consider how chaotic and unpredictable just broadcasting is in general, right? Where are games being aired? Like, you have to rummage through 6 different streaming platforms to find out where a game is on these days. And contracts are constantly changing. And depending on the sport, national games are on 3 or 4 different networks. It boils down to even more on the local side. If you're fortunate, you get to have your college games like we do at Quinnipiac on ESPN Plus, but others are on Flow Sports. I'm not a big fan of Flow Sports. It's really expensive. I think you're losing audience, and it can change at a moment's notice. So from that standpoint, I think it is a little bit chaotic, and so many things have changed. So many network deals have changed in just the last few years, with TNT losing the NBA, and now it's on NBC, and it's on Amazon, and it's on Peacock, and wherever else it's on these days. And same with the NHL, split between ESPN and TNT from a network perspective. And those presentations couldn't be any more different. Now, on the flip side, if you are a younger broadcaster, the opportunities are endless, because when you and I were going to Fordham, when I was at Fordham, we covered Fordham football, Fordham basketball, and that was it. That's all we had. And I was lucky enough to get to call some baseball games on WFUV. I did a whopping 2. It was back when Fordham played in the ECA. And it's funny because I work in the ECAC for hockey, but it was ECAC baseball, and the winner of the tournament would go to the NCAA tournament. And we went and covered the entire week up in Waterbury. And Kyle Casey was with us. You mentioned Kyle, and Jerry Shea, who graduated a year before I did. The three of us were basically the only people available that were there to do it. It was after sophomore year. And so we spent an entire week at a Howard Johnson. We were doing daily updates during the afternoon shows. And here's what they said. Well, if Fordham gets to the championship game, you can broadcast those games, which turned out to be a blessing and a curse, because I got to call some baseball. I had never done baseball play-by-play before. On the other hand, the games were on at the exact same time as Kale and Gale. And that was probably the most popular show on the station at the time. And the poor studio engineer just got ripped. Calls by the hundreds all day long, while we ended up doing about 7 hours of coverage. Fordham ended up losing the first game. It was double elimination, so they had to play a winner-take-all second game. Fordham ended up winning the championship. And one other WFUV connection, the winning pitcher in that game was Charlie Kuchara, who is a WFUV one-on-one host, but he was also a player on the Fordham baseball team. And he's been working in media for years. He's an AD for the New York Islanders. And he was with the Mets for a long time, and he's still in the industry and has been, as long as we have. So just completely wild stuff.
That's amazing. And I can relate to those stories when you're thinking about the games you broadcast in college on an afternoon, when it competed with some of the most sought after real estate on the radio at WFUV. I want to ask you something you said on your Pulse recently was I thought really an interesting comment. You said sports fans change, people change, sports fans and the way they consume media change, what they demand from their media, whether it's TV or radio, changes. What do you mean by that?
So let's think about it first from a technology standpoint. So if you go back to how sports broadcasting originated, it was initially a radio thing. If you want to even go before that, it was literally like Morse code. It was like a ticker. And they'd have, if you go back to the very early World Series, if you weren't at the game, people would congregate, some part of town. There'd be a big, basically a board that looked like a ball field, and they would wire, like, if a guy got a hit or made an out, and there'd be some kid there moving the guys along the bases. If you ever see if you ever saw 8 Men Out, there's descriptions of that. So that was probably the first way sports was described in quote unquote real time, which it really wasn't. Then you get into radio, and it's the real true theater of the mind, because in many cases you might be covering the game at the ballpark, or you're covering the game in a studio, and you're there, and Jesse, who's out in Michigan, Strassler Goldberg or Goldberg Strassler, I always get those names flipped around, does one of those games every year where he sits in his studio and he's got the drumsticks with the crack of the bat and the whole thing. And that's how road games were covered for many years. So the broadcaster would often make up stuff in describing it, getting the results same way. And then you get to television, and now It's not just regular television, it's television, it's streaming on the internet, it's alternate feeds based on what you're interested in. If I'm a guy that likes to gamble, I'm not just going to get the traditional play-by-play feed. I'm going to get the play-by-play feed with a couple of, FanDuel guys sitting and quote unquote calling the game, but it really has nothing to do with the game. It has to do with all of the different gambling elements that can take place in real time, all the prop bets and things along those lines. So, and then I think too, there's that, but then the evolution of social media, and I think just how people are these days with really short attention spans and the inability to sit there and focus on a broadcast for 3 hours, and you want to capture their attention and they want, bigger, more exciting, you're trying to compete for their attention. And there are extremes of that. I'm not suggesting that everyone goes Gus Johnson on their broadcasts and scream for 3 hours, but I think broadcasters that seem to gain more favor these days are, at least in certain sports, are a little bit bigger with their calls. So a good example, is Al Michaels. Al Michaels, he's on the Mount Rushmore of football broadcasters. But partially now, he's in his 80s. And I always argue that he has seen everything. It's really hard. Al Michaels has called NFL games for 40, 50 years. So he has seen everything. It's probably pretty hard to get him over the top excited. And he's never been an over the top excited guy. That's just how he presents himself. And, 30, 40 years ago, fans were totally acceptable of that. And now they're not as accepting of it. So if it's a duller game or a bit of a lackluster game, he's not going to mince words and he's going to call it like a dull game. And I don't know if fans necessarily like that. I think they still want a little bit of juice. Even if the game on the turf isn't as exciting as it should be, they're watching it. They're hoping that the announcer at least gets a little bit excited. So I think in that sense, how people take in the game, partially due to technology, and Bob Costas is another great example, although he just called a White Sox game a couple of weeks ago. And I thought he sounded great. Like, I thought he did a fantastic job calling that game, and he was excited and he had juice. And I had suggested too on the play-by-play pulse that the one thing he's never done in his career is call games for a local team. If I was the White Sox, I'd hand them 40 to 50 games, call them all at home, give them a local package, and their ratings would be excellent. And I think he would do a fantastic job. And it's much easier to get into a rhythm calling games for a team on a daily basis, as opposed to if you're parachuting in. It's unfair. It was unfair for a guy like Bob Costas, and I've criticized his work as well when, he parachutes in to do some playoff games, and he really didn't call a lot of regular season baseball, and he didn't have a great chemistry with Ron Darling, and it wasn't the best of what he was able to deliver. And he heard about it. And that's why he kind of partially retired. Maybe that's a little premature. I think the right scenario would be great for him. What he's doing now with NBC on Sunday nights is fantastic. I think it's right where he belongs too.
I think, you mentioned the Mount Rushmore, and all of your points are great. I enjoyed that version of your pulse. There's no perfect broadcaster, but in my opinion, Bob Costas is as close as you can get from a person who can do games at the field, studio hosting. His studio hosting is remarkable, and I've always been a big fan of that, and just how versatile he is, just incredible. Who are some of the other names in your mind that you grew up watching, or maybe or even before that you would put up on that Mount Rushmore?
To me, I think it almost has to vary on the sport. There are so many excellent announcers that to just create a Mount Rushmore of 4 is extremely difficult to do. For me, when it comes to baseball, Vin Scully deserves, I think, first and foremost to be on that. Of course, he called other sports, football and golf, and he might have even done tennis for a while. And he hosted game shows and did a lot of stuff outside of just being a baseball announcer. But his baseball is what makes him far and above the greatest at that sport. I wouldn't necessarily put him on a Mount Rushmore, as good as he was doing football, calling football, because his strengths didn't necessarily play as well as they do for baseball. I think Bob Costas, if you're talking about versatility, Bob Costas is there. Al Michaels is another broadcaster because, like Bob, it does all the play-by-play, but he also did studio. He was anchoring as well. He anchored Olympics, and he did some of that, toward the tail end of the ABC era of Olympics. I think today you look at Mike Tirico as a guy that can do all of that as well and do all of it very well. I think the only sport I've never heard him call is baseball, but honestly, and I know he's a big hockey fan, his hockey broadcasting is outstanding. To me, if NBC had the NHL, he to me would be their number one guy. And then obviously with Sunday Night Football and his work with the NBA, he does everything exceptionally well. So, there's versatility. And then you start looking at other sports. And baseball, to me, it's more of the old school guys, and it's Scully and it's Red Barber. And, you could say Mel Allen, because I think there's something about baseball on radio and learning it on radio that really there's just that something extra that you don't get as much out of from broadcasters that learn the game on TV. There are some exceptions. I think Jason Benetti's a good exception as to someone that probably got raised in the more television environment, but still does do a fantastic job. But when you think about like Gary Cohen is a guy that really, earned his bones on radio. And so many of them, Joe Buck is a guy that's kind of bridge, kind of straddles that line a little bit, but he learned from his dad, Jack Buck, radio. So I think when it comes to that, it's the radio with basketball. I think Mike Breen, I think now at this point, he has to be considered the GOAT of basketball announcers. And I grew up on Marv Albert, and why I loved, I was a huge Knicks fan as a kid, loving Marv Albert and the way he called games. And at this point, it's Mike Breen. And you can talk about Chick Hearn or some others, and there's so many. I mean, Kevin Harlan, Ian Eagle, there's a lot of other names. And then for me in hockey, Doc Emmerich for American-born hockey announcers, but there are greats up in Canada. If you want to talk about the Foster Hewitts and the Danny Gallavans of the world, Dan Kelly Sr., of course, was amazing. There were so many great hockey broadcasters in Canada that, it's an endless list. So for me, it's hard to always come up with just like a single Mount Rushmore. So I know I'm kind of dodging it a little bit, but honestly, that's just how I feel.
It's impossible because your point is excellent. The fact that it's based on the sport, and then you can go so deep into the history, into the annals, and there are so many names that don't get mentioned that should. Mm-hmm. You brought up hockey. You recently did a Pulse episode, which I really enjoyed, talking about the conclusion of Hockey Night in Canada. So that is something that hopefully people can check out. I've got your Phil G PBP here, so people can check out your social media, because you put a lot of great stuff on social media, and you're also doing coaching now for sports broadcasters. What can a sportscaster learn from you, and how can they connect with you, and what kind of service and help can you provide?
Well, you can find me on any of my socials. My DMs are always open, and I've been doing this on and off for a few years, actually. And I find time. I don't take on very many clients per se to coach, a handful usually each year, a couple of recurring clients that I work with on a regular basis. And, for me, and I've been coached, and we talk about Marty Glickman, and a lot of my philosophy is based on that. When I go and critique broadcasters, I kind of start with that. I've evolved it a little bit because I think, especially with younger announcers, you and I have sat in those rooms with Marty, on cassette tape. You get 10 seconds in, stop, and then he's going to berate you for 10 minutes, right? And I think that's how we learn things. I don't know if anyone today really appreciates that. There probably are some, hard-nosed kids out there that kind of like that, and there are many others that don't. So I am not, while I am, equally critical in the analysis that I give. I deliver it in a little bit more of a positive way. And, it comes with documentation. I really like to take time to listen to somebody's work, 2 or 3 times, and I put notes together very, and depending on how much, we're working on, it could be a page or two in notes. It could be 3 or 4 pages. We follow it up with a Zoom call and we go over everything. And so we do put a lot into it when working with a student. And for me, I've also been coached by other people outside. So, especially in TV, it's one thing to be coached by someone else who does what you do as a play-by-play announcer. But the last couple of coaches that I've worked with are producers. So I've worked with John Fazalo, who was a director and producer at ESPN for years. And then I also worked a little bit with Howie Deneroff, who was at Westwood One forever. Um, and the reason why I like working with folks that aren't necessarily just play-by-play broadcasters is because they think about the broadcast differently than we do, especially for me, who was trained on the radio side of things. Oftentimes, there are many elements that we're not thinking of that are part of the overall production. And I like getting that feedback because it helps me, as someone who has only been in TV for a relatively short time compared to radio, things that I like to work on, things that I should be working on for a TV delivery. And depending on who I'm working with, I try to bring in some of those elements. And you know what? At the end of the day, it's not always a broadcaster that hires you. It's someone else, and their perspective of what makes a good broadcast can be wildly different than how you or I think.
It's a great point. In getting different objective opinions. Sometimes, I mean, obviously, number one, watching yourself, listening to yourself is the best way to learn. But you need other voices because people are going to see things, hear things that you just don't pick up. And it's hilarious when you talk about sitting in those rooms with Marty. I can remember, and I'm sure you did the same thing. You'd walk in with your tape, all queued up to what you thought was the best part of that game. He puts the tape in, and then he hits fast forward, lets it go for 10 seconds, and then hits stop.
Yep.
And I said, Marty, that's not where I wanted you to listen. And he would say, there's always somebody new tuning into the game, turning on the radio. You've got to be at your best the whole time. And that was one of the great pearls he brought up. When you're talking with sportscasters, if someone comes to you now, Phil, it's 2026, and they say, what are some of the biggest keys for me to become a better sportscaster? What are some of the things that jump out to you?
Reps and prep. I mean, it's all about reps and prep. So depending on how often you're broadcasting, at Fordham, we didn't get very many reps. We were rotating with other broadcasters. I don't know. It might've been when you started that maybe 1 or 2 people did the bulk of the basketball season or football or whatever. Well, when I was at Fordham, it wasn't like that. We would rotate. So I maybe called, I don't know, over the 2 years that I was sports manager at WFUV, maybe 30 games. It wasn't very much. So every game, it was important. And at that time, you wanted home games. You got better sounding tape than when you were on the road. Now it doesn't necessarily matter. But it was different because you didn't get those reps. And today that is not something you have to worry about. You can make reps on your own. You can make reps with an iPhone sitting in front of the TV. You can go buy a ticket to a game and sit at the top of the bleachers. It could be any sport. It doesn't really matter. And sometimes it doesn't even matter who's playing in the game, right? You're just trying to learn the mechanics of calling a game, doing basic play-by-play. At that point, if you're just doing it for yourself to learn the players, the stats, none of that really matters. But you can go to the next level and do it off of TV. Absolutely. And then prep. I'm a big prep guy. Prep is hugely important to me. My rule of thumb is, about 2 hours for every hour I'm on the air. When it comes to the sports I regularly cover, hockey, and then I do some other sports as well. And sometimes it has to be more. I did some lacrosse last week. I don't do lacrosse very often. I got to do, it was 3 play-by-plays on state championship lacrosse. I hadn't seen any state lacrosse this year, so I had to prep even more just to kind of catch up. So it depends on the sport that you're getting. Baseball, sometimes it's a little bit less because it's every single day. And when you're following a team from day to day, the dynamic is a little bit different versus if you're a network guy coming in to do a game of the week, you really have to bone up, I think, a little bit more. Kind of like NFL guys when they go in and do, you hear them, they're doing a 40-hour week before calling the game. That's a completely other animal. But for me, the prep is key. And yeah, you're going to use maybe 20-25% of it, but you never know what's going to happen during a broadcast. And then it's also, and this was kind of the Vin Scully method. There's a great YouTube clip where he goes into great detail. I have shared it a bunch of times, and how he prepares for baseball, because it's not just about preparing for the series. It's about taking whatever you get, and you may use it 30 games from now, 40, 50 games from now in some other series, just because it's something you came across. He would cut it out and put it in some book and kind of leave it there. And then, when the time came, he would have it. He'd remember having that little tidbit, and then he would have a story that sounded like he just made it up off the top of his head. And I know that some of those stories he made up off the top of his head, especially later in his career. He had so much knowledge, but a lot of those other stories were based off of things he found, and he just delivered it so amazingly well that it sounded like it was just a spur of the moment thing that popped into his head. That's what made him so great. But it was meticulous preparation is what got him there.
Those are some great points. You brought up 5 or 6 things right there that we could spend an hour on each of them. But I love that thought about preparation, and I certainly urge any aspiring sportscaster, check out Phil. Here are his handles. Make sure to watch his pulse on social media. And if you want somebody to listen to your information, listen to your tape, critique your broadcasting, help make you better, I urge you to contact Phil. And Phil, this is fantastic, because this is what sports broadcasters need. You told so many stories today that help sportscasters understand what they should expect when they enter this career, and some of the pitfalls, some of the great things. If you had to wrap it up for a new sportscaster joining this industry in 2026, is it a good time to join this industry?
It's always a good time to join this industry. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, there are other sportscasters who be like, get out of it, it's changing. I mean, look, if you love sports, this is what you love to do. I'm not going to be the guy that says, no, don't do it. So you kind of have to learn for yourself. Is it uber competitive? Is it kind of that dog eat dog world out there? Do you have to scratch and claw? Sure. But you could say that about a number of other industries as well. I liken it to, you think about, the world of acting, or being a musician in a band or something like that. We work in, it's a little bit science, but it's also a big art. And how far you get is going to be partially determined by how hard you work, but the other half of it is going to be how you're received. And you don't know the answer to that other part until you try to put yourself out there and see kind of where it goes. And there are many that start, and a lot of folks that kind of drop off after a couple of years, and that's always been that way. And I think it'll continue to be that way.
No question about it. Well, again, this has been great. The information that you put out at the Play-by-Play Pulse and on social media is invaluable, not only for sports broadcasters, but sports fans. So hopefully everyone will connect with you. Here are some of the ways. And Phil, we really appreciate this. This has been great. It's been a lot of fun, and we could probably talk for a few hours more, but we're going to wrap it up for today. This has been a lot of fun. We appreciate it. Thank you for your time, Phil.
Oh, Rick, this was an absolute blast. So much. I had so much fun. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm sure we'll do it again in the future.
Yes, let's do it again. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and we'll talk again soon.
You got it.